This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 23 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last episode was an extremely enjoyable and informative discussion with author David Fitzgerald. Once again, I will reiterate, please check out his books, Nailed 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed, and of course his amazing book for all Mormon history enthusiasts, The Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion, Book 1, The Mormons. Both books are very well written and present a lot of good arguments and facts. I cannot recommend them highly enough. And once again, thank you, David, for coming on and having such a scintillating conversation about everything Mormonism and a little bit of Jesus. It was really fun talking to you. Now, let's move on to the regular timeline and historical analysis. That's what everybody comes to this show for. Last historical episode, we started out talking about Joe's two 1830 trials and the fallout from them. He was hated and persecuted, in scare quotes, by seemingly every person in Colesville, and he could no longer step foot in the town without being chased out. Next, we covered Joe's shit list of so-called persecutors. He listed the names of Cyrus McMaster, the celebrated Dr. Nathan Boynton, and Abraham Benton. Basically, when we boiled it down, these people were members of the same Presbyterian church that bossman Josiah Stowell was a part of, and most had close family ties. That's why they brought up the lawsuits against Joe and his swindling tactics, all on behalf of bossman Josiah Stowell. Once we covered all the familial and societal connections among all these relevant people, we deconstructed the Mormon side of the argument to explain the evidence, as opposed to the non- or anti-Mormon side of the argument. In my mind, the non-Mormon explanation seemed to encapsulate the evidence much better than the Mormon side. The Mormon side said that Joe was a real prophet of God and was being persecuted for his divinity claims. The anti-Mormon side said that he was a two-timing, bold-faced, unapologetic, lying scoundrel with misplaced delusions of grandeur, and the locals hated him for it. Like I said, from the picture we're constructing of Joseph Smith, the non-Mormon or anti-Mormon version of this charismatic genius seems to fill the historical void much better than the Mormon side. After talking about the so-called persecution of Joe, we moved on to talk about his very first revelation that would be included in the Pearl of Great Price, Chapter 1 plus of the Book of Moses. This led us into the argument that Joe was perhaps the biggest offender of taking the Lord's name in vain since the biblical Jesus himself. Joe wasn't cursing things using curse word with God in them like fuck Jesus in the ass with a 3-iron. He was speaking in the name of God as God's mouthpiece, issuing revelations on behalf of God. This is exactly what the 10 Commandments strongly abhor when they say, "Thou shalt not take the name of Yahweh in vain." Well, Joe wouldn't be constrained to biblical commands or even care about Bible scholarship or knowledge, even though he was supposedly called to be a prophet by that same God as described in the Bible. After deconstructing how much Joe doesn't give half of two shits about the Bible or the God of the Bible, we talked about Joe's newest revelation, hot off the press. He basically gave Ollie Cowdung Oliver Cowdery a revelation to continue in his service of the church and to get his argumentative ass to Colesville to baptize the new converts there, because Joe was totally covering his ass with his tail firmly tucked between his legs and was way too scared to go back. Among these revelations to Ollie and others, Joe made a fatal mistake, in Ollie's opinion. Joe said that he would have no strength for temporal labors and that the church would support him and Emma, which was in direct conflict with the commandments against priestcraft in the Book of Mormon. Ollie didn't like this and went to the Whitmer house in Fayette, New York, instead of going to Colesville. There, Ollie convinced all of the Whitmers to rally against Joe because he had just given a false revelation. I mean, this wasn't the first one. Apparently, Ollie had forgotten about the trips up to Canada to sell the copyright of the Book of Mormon. If we remember back, Joe gave Ollie and some others revelations saying they would be able to sell the copyright for $8,000 in Canada somewhere. Well, the revelation failed multiple times, and Joe was able to rationalize it away by saying something along the lines of, some revelations are of God, some are from the devil, and some are from man. Well, whatever the fuck that means, which was just a preemptive catch-all clause for any fuck-ups that Joe made in his revelations from then on. It was a really smart feature to build into it. Well, when Joe gave the revelation that priestcraft, of course, which meant making money off of the church, was now okay, just so he didn't have to worry about working for an honest job or for an honest wage anymore, Ollie was extremely offended. So he turned the Whitmers against Joe. Joe had to go there and win back the family by first petitioning the weakest chink in the armor. That was Christian Whitmer. Christian eventually came around to Joe's way of rationalizing away the contradiction, and the rest of the Whitmer family slowly followed. This was the newest peak of Joe's amazing charisma, saving his ass from certain mutiny in June of 1830. We finished out the last episode talking about Ollie's chiding letter to Joe about the priestcraft contradiction pulled from the History of the Church, Volume 1. I personally think that this was Oliver Cowdery's first attempt at usurping Joe's holy crown atop the mantle that the Book of Mormon rocketed him to. This wouldn't be the last time that Ollie tried to take what he thought was rightfully his, but it was one of the first times that we know of him standing up to Joe. Ollie finally grew a spine to stand up to Joe with, and Joe broke that spine by sneaking back in and snatching up the Whitmers one by one and beating Ollie down with progressively more dominating revelations. This power dynamic will become quite familiar for a while, until Ollie finally gets enough of Joe's relentless bullshit and snaps. Alright, that's enough for a roundup. Let's move on to today's episode. We're going to start off by covering something that we've already talked about, only in much greater detail and context. Let's get the context part of it out of the way. After Joe went to Fayette, New York to reconvince the Whitmers that he was totally for realsies and Ollie was wrong, Joe decided to go back to Harmony, Pennsylvania. John and Peter Whitmer tagged along, and there in Harmony, Joe met with Newell Knight and his wife to take care of some business. It occurred to Joe and Newell that Emma and Newell's wife hadn't been confirmed into the church. They had been baptized, but not confirmed during a congregation of the church. Well, Joe decided in early August of 1830 that it was finally time to confirm them, even though Emma had been baptized more than a month before. Of course, for this confirmation to be official, they needed to perform a sacrament ceremony. Well, this brought up an issue. Joe didn't have any wine to use for the ceremony, so he ran on an errand to get some. Presumably at this time, though, Joe didn't have the money for a bottle of middle-aged housewife happy juice, so he just went wandering until a convenient revelation spontaneously struck him. This later comprised the Book of Commandments, chapter 28. I'll just read the first 3 verses here. Quote, "Listen to the voice of Jesus Christ, your Lord, your God, and your Redeemer, whose word is quick and powerful. For behold, I say unto you, that it mattereth not what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, when ye partake of the sacrament, if it so be that ye do it with an eye single to my glory. Remembering unto the Father my body which was laid down for you, and my blood which was shed for the remission of your sins. End quote. This is how Joe got out of buying that expensive bottle of wine back then, and how the church today gets out of buying barrels of wine for every congregation to take sacrament with today. Like I said, this was convenient revelation that Joe just magically shit out of Mr. Hat at the most opportune time. He kind of had a habit for doing that. This was just a small aside to move us into the next problem that Joe and company ran into. And it was in harmony. Well, can you guess what happened? You got it! Persecution! According to Joe, in the History of the Church Volume 1, there was a Methodist minister that started coming around the Hale farm in Harmony and smack-talking Joe. Joe didn't even give us his name, and that's how much he disliked him, but I would make a wild guess that it was the same minister that was over the same Methodist congregation that Joe attended with Emma right after his kid died in June of 1828. This is just my speculation because we're taking this out of Joe's dictated history of the church, and he's setting the narrative for us here, but I would be willing to bet that this was the same Methodist minister. Let's face it, Joe was having a rough patch in his life when his and Emma's first son died a few days after childbirth. We know that he went to a Methodist congregation in or near Harmony after this tragedy, and it's not a huge jump in logic to conclude that they both sought counseling with the minister after the whole thing went down. This minister might have picked up on a few cues that Joe was planning on starting his own religion. By now in our timeline, the minister probably caught wind that Joe had published his own book, and he probably went to the Hale farm to talk some sense into the Hale family, and Isaac specifically. I'm willing to bet that this minister didn't want to see the entire Hale family dwindle in unbelief like the Whitmer family had done once they bought into Joe's snake oil. He probably didn't want to lose any more of his herd to the ravenous wolf that was Joseph Smith, and therefore took it upon himself to convince the Hales and anybody else he could that Joe was indeed a wolf in Seer Stoner's clothing. But, like I said, I don't know if there's anything backing up this connection, so it's just my speculation. The only reason I mention it is to draw an earlier connection to Joe with these people that he called persecuting him. Well, this quote-unquote persecution led to Joe's undoing in Harmony, because the Hales were finally fed up with Joe's incessant bullshit. Isaac basically told Joe that the Hale farm would no longer be a safe haven for Joe's base of operations, and he needed to pay up on his mortgage note. I would assume that the local members of the same Methodist congregation were getting fired up about Joe too, which was just one more added pressure. So Joe and company decided to jump ship and move to Fayette, but not without trying another stab at Colesville first. According to Joe, something pretty miraculous happens here. I'll just read this straight from the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 108. Before doing so, I need to mention that Ollie was still up in Fayette overseeing church activities and basically running the church for himself in Joe's absence. The last time Ollie did this, Joe had to go to Fayette on a special trip to put out the fire and slowly convince the Whitmers one by one that he was super-de-duper legit. Well, Ollie had been running the Fayette congregation for a month and a half by himself. We'll get to the problems that created very soon. But first, let's go to the History of the Church, Volume 1, like I said earlier. Quote, towards the latter end of August, in company with John and David Whitmer and my brother Hiram Smith, I visited the church at Colesville, New York, well knowing that the determined hostility of our enemies in that quarter, and also knowing that it was our duty to visit the church. We had called upon our Heavenly Father in mighty prayer that He would grant us an opportunity of meeting with them, that He would blind the eyes of our enemies so that they would not know us, and that we might on this occasion return unmolested. Our prayers were not in vain, for when within a little distance of Mr. Knight's place, we encountered a large company at work upon the public road, amongst whom were several of our most bitter enemies. They looked earnest at us, but, not knowing us, we passed on without interruption. That evening we assembled the church and confirmed them, partook of the sacrament, and held a happy meeting, having much reason to rejoice in the God of our salvation, and sing hosannas to his holy name." End quote. So, according to Joe, he prayed to God that he would be able to travel through Colesville without being recognized or lynched like some kind of Nephi Laban Mormon face-shifting superpower shit. When they got there, the people that saw him walking down the street apparently stared him down. But somehow, even though the people saw him, Joe thought they didn't recognize him or something. It wasn't because they were all too stunned to see him there, right? I mean, just daring to walk down the street like a badass. It's just because they didn't recognize the person they were trying to lynch after the long month since Joe had been there last. I mean, I guess, but, well, apparently the townspeople got a clue pretty quickly because they organized the mob once again to chase Joe out of town. Luckily for Joe, he was only in Colesville for a day, and the mob showed up too late to do anything to him. He was already making his way back down the road for a quick stop in Harmony. Once Joe and company were back in Harmony, Joseph Knight Sr., who lives in Colesville, remember, came along to their rescue. You see, Joe didn't need to visit Colesville for the single purpose of confirming the people there. He also made the trip to petition the help of an old friend. So, Joseph Knight Sr. arrived in Harmony a few days after Joe and company had arrived, for the simple purpose of moving Joe and Emma back to Fayette. They were no longer welcome in Harmony, and Joe had fallen way too far behind on his mortgage note to Isaac Hale, so they were effectively kicked out. This would be the second time that Joe and Emma would move from Harmony to Fayette, thanks primarily to the actions of Joe's father-in-law, Isaac. Like I've said before, Isaac really hated Joseph. So, Joe and Emma, and of course everybody else that was hanging out with them, make it to Fayette on Joseph Knight Sr.'s dime, and Joe arrives to a mess in the congregation. Maybe not so much of a mess as yet another fire he had to put out to resume his control. But remember how I said earlier that Ollie had been running the Fayette congregation for a while all by himself? And how I said that they created some problems? Well, this is a fire that Joe would either quell or be consumed by. We talked about Hiram Page's revelation quite some time ago, but now we have the context built in leading up to the situation. Joe had been absent from the Fayette congregation for long enough that they were relying on each other's powers of prophecy to advance the church towards its end game. What was the end game, you might ask? Well, Mormonism is a restorationist or Zionist sect. They believed that Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built upon the American continent, that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory. That's basically in line with what most Christians believe about Jerusalem in general, but of course Mormonism is a little different because it's on the American continent, the new promised land, as opposed to the old school promised land that was the real Jerusalem. Well, without their real prophet Joe, the Fayette congregation sought new prophecy from other elders that were in the church. You see, Ollie had already grown a spine and had it smashed by Joe once, so he wasn't so eager to do it again. But Hiram Page hadn't felt the wrath of Jesus fire-powered up Joseph yet, and he didn't mind giving his version of Zion-related revelation in the absence of Joe. Like I said earlier, we covered this a little while ago, but it helps a lot to understand Joe's character more and his fleeting feelings of control over his congregations with proper context, and maybe even see him acting out of desperation. So let's read Joe's perspective concerning this blatant subversion to his divine prophetic authority. This is also taken from the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 109. Quote, "To our great grief, however, we soon found that Satan had been lying in wait to deceive and seeking whom he might devour. Brother Hiram Page had in his possession a certain stone by which he had obtained certain revelations, in scare quotes, concerning the upbuilding of Zion, the order of the church, etc., all of which were entirely at variance with the order of God's house as laid down in the New Testament as well as in our late revelations. As a conference meeting had been appointed for the 26th of September, I thought it wisdom not to do much more than converse with the brethren on the subject until the conference should meet. Finding, however, that many, especially the Whitmer family and Oliver Cowdery, were believing much in the things set forth by this stone, we thought it best to inquire of the Lord concerning so important a matter, and before conference convened we received the following." Next, it goes into the revelation that Joe received to hopefully ameliorate the situation. This is found in the Book of Commandments, chapter 30. Quote, "Behold, I say unto thee, Oliver, that it shall be given unto thee, that thou shalt be heard by the church, in all things whatsoever thou shalt teach them by the Comforter, concerning the revelations and commandments which I have given. But, behold, verily, verily, I say unto thee," that was like 8 words and 5 commas. Yeah, Joseph was no genius in his writing style. "No one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith, Jr., for he receiveth them even as Moses. And thou shalt be obedient unto the things which I shall give unto him, even as Aaron, to declare faithfully the commandments and the revelations, with power and authority unto the church." So basically, Joe is just telling Ollie to go be a missionary, and that's about it. "And if thou art led at any time by the Comforter to speak or teach, or at all times by the way of commandment unto the church, thou mayest do it. Go preach somewhere, Ollie," that's what he's saying. "But thou shalt not write by way of commandment, but by wisdom." So Joe said he can write wisdom, but he can't write commandment, basically. Which dovetails perfectly into the next verse. "And thou shalt not command him who is at thy head, and at the head of the church." There it is. Nobody can command the prophet. That was Joseph Smith. He was building that into the structure of it. Nobody can command him, but he can command you. He was smart about it. "For I have given him the keys of the mysteries, and the revelations which are sealed, until I shall appoint unto them another in his stead." Interesting. Brigham Young wasn't appointed. He was voted. That's fascinating. Anyway, we're going to skip verse 8 for just a second, and we'll come back to it later. Verse 9. "And now, behold, I say unto you that it is not revealed, and no man knoweth where the city Zion shall be built, but it shall be given hereafter. Behold, I say unto you that it shall be on the borders by the Lamanites." Okay, there's what Joe was saying about the revelation that Hiram Page gave, because no man can know where the city of Zion is, but he's going to tell them hereafter. Oh, and by the way, it's on the borders by the Lamanites. The same thing he's been saying about it the whole time. "And again, thou shalt take thy brother Hiram Page between him and thee alone, and tell him that those things which he hath written from that stone are not of me, and that Satan deceiveth him." So there it is. Hiram Page was misbehaving. Ollie had suffered the wrath of punishment for misbehaving before. So Joe went to Ollie and said, "Go take brother Hiram Page by the shoulder and tell him that the revelations that he gave are from Satan, and the ones that I give are from God. Nobody usurp my authority. For behold, these things have not been appointed unto him, neither shall anything be appointed unto any of this church contrary to the church's covenants." End quote. And there's Joe just reinforcing the power structure that he's on top of. So Hiram Page stone-sided this revelation that apparently it told the people in the Fayette church where Zion would be built up. And Joe didn't like this, because if somebody else was able to reveal stuff that only Joe was supposed to be able to reveal, Joe's revelations are pushed into obscurity by the newest prophet in town. In this case, Hiram Page, whereas previously it had just been Ollie that was trying to usurp this authority. Joe wouldn't let this happen, of course, and he issued these revelations saying that he is the only real prophet and that Oliver Cowdery doesn't have the authority to write commandments or command the person that's at the head of the church. Joe just further solidified his own authority by commanding Ollie to take Hiram Page to the side and tell him that the revelations he wrote were actually from the devil and that the revelations and Seerstone needed to be destroyed. I want you to put yourself in Ollie's shoes here. Let's insert the human element. Think of how he felt during the whole priestcraft gate scandal that had just happened. Ollie tried to call Joe out on a blatant contradiction between one doctrine that was contained in the Book of Mormon and a recent revelation concerning priestcraft. Ollie had gone to the work of convincing all the Whitmers that Joe was mistaken in this revelation and might not be quite as awesome as everybody thought. He had officially undermined Joe's self-claimed authority and had the Whitmers on his side. Ollie finally got up enough courage to send Joe a scathing letter confronting him about the two-faced nature of Joe's recent revelation. Upon receiving this letter, Joe made a special trip up to Fayette to win back the Whitmers and destroy the small foundation that Ollie had established for himself to stand up to Joe with. Do you think Ollie would have just taken this all into stride? Would this soul and ego crush that Joe just inflicted on Ollie simply roll off Ollie's back? Fuck no! Ollie would still feel reprimanded, and Joe would have felt backstabbed and unable to trust Ollie. The tension between them must have been hair-raising. Then you factor in the situation with Joe returning to Colesville to confirm the new members there. Joe had commanded Ollie to go to Colesville and take care of that problem at least twice by now, and Ollie simply refused. Joe had to go himself and take care of it instead of sending his little bitch boy serial Baptist Ollie to do all the work and all the traveling and the putting life endangering. Then Joe came back to Fayette after this absence with hard feelings still lingering between him and Ollie. Once Joe returned and found out that the Whitmers, Hiram Page, Ollie, and a bunch of other people had all turned against him again, subversion that was probably incited by Ollie, Joe commanded Ollie to rein in the chaos and fix all the problems, all while once again smashing that foundation that Ollie was repairing to try and stand on top of against Joe again. Think of how pissed off and betrayed you would feel if you were Ollie. There's no way of knowing for sure if these were the actual emotions flying around the Fayette congregation, but with everything leading up to this time in September of 1830, how could this not be the way Ollie and Joe felt towards each other? There must have been so much tension. So I want to pose a hypothetical here. Now, keep this in mind. This is just a hypothetical, but it does serve to explain why Ollie was doing what he was doing and being so subversive. This doesn't even stretch reality that far, and it actually serves to give some explanatory power for the evidence. What if Ollie and Joe started up the Book of Mormon together, with the agreement that they would both lead the church that would result from the book's publication? What if they were both starting up this co-con together as equal partners, yet Joe was slowly squeezing Ollie out of full partnership status? Let that sit for a second. Ollie tried to translate some of the plates by the same rock and hat method as Joe used, and Joe came out with a revelation saying that he would be the only person able to translate any of the Book of Mormon. Ollie was one of the 3 witnesses that helped to convince not-so-smarty Marty Harris to fund the Book of Mormon. Ollie helped Joe with the finer points of the organization of the church. Ollie led the first sermon of the church at the first congregation. Ollie performed almost all of the baptisms and confirmations of the early church. Ollie was tasked with some of the earliest proselyting campaigns, while Joe spent most of that time lazing around Harmony, Pennsylvania. How could Ollie not think that he was the most important person in the church? Add in to all the work that Ollie was responsible for the fact that Joe would undermine or chastise Ollie any time that he would challenge Joe's authority, and would use nothing but irrefutable personal revelation from God to do so. Anytime Ollie tried to run the church the way he saw fit, Joe would smack him down with another precious revelation that Ollie couldn't challenge, and Joe chastised him for being a sinner against the kingdom of God. Ollie must have felt betrayed and beaten down and backstabbed and all kinds of other unpleasant emotions that we can't even comprehend today. Joe is like the worst possible business partner in the entire fucking everywhere by this point. So now in September of 1830, keeping all these compounding factors in mind, Joe rolled into Fayette to see how the church was doing after his successful Colesville congregation and had to fight it out with Ollie again to reestablish his control. The church had gone off the fucking rails in Joe's mind. Ollie was leading the congregations. The Whitmers didn't believe in Joe again. Hiram Page had given revelation with his own stone that was way better than the recent revelations that Joe was coming out with. Cats and dogs were living with each other. The Josephite church was falling to pieces. So Joe had to do some proper stomping around and chest pounding to get his main cronies reined back in and get this fustercluck back into working order under the almighty prophet Joseph Smith. Does this seem to provide a little better context as to why he gave the revelations that we read earlier? Specifically these ones. Verses 2, 6, 9, and 11, quote, "But behold, verily, verily, I say unto thee," that's the fucking verse with weird-ass punctuation, "no one shall be appointed to receive commandments and revelations in this church, excepting my servant Joseph Smith, Jr., for he receiveth them even as Moses." He was trying to reestablish his control. "And thou shalt not command him who is at thy head and at the head of the church." Joe was establishing his control again. "And now behold, I say unto you that it is not revealed, and no man knoweth where the city Zion shall be built, but it shall be given hereafter. Behold, I say unto you that it shall be on the borders by the Lamanites." Joe coming up with revelation that superseded Hiram Page's revelation, just ensuring his leadership position again. "And again, thou shalt take thy brother Hiram Page between him and thee alone, and tell him that those things which he hath written from that stone are not of me, and that Satan deceiveth him." And there he says that if anybody opposes him, Satan is deceiving them. That's all that Joe was doing. This was desperate. He was grasping at straws, trying to reestablish himself alone as the leader. When I've said in the past that Joe used revelations to solve any little problem or inconsistency in the church, I meant it every time. Divine revelation is a really smart tool built into the structure of the church, and Joe had no problem using it. It was his special move. A Joe Hadouken, if you will. Think of what might have been going through Ollie's mind by this point. Think of everything he and Joe had been through together, and now Ollie was just another pawn in Joe's prophet game. You can spell that prophet either way. Earlier, when we read the majority of those revelations, we skipped over verse 8 and said we would come back to it. Well, once Joe put out all of the various fires that were cropping up, or, well, maybe being deliberately set by Ollie, the church ran somewhat smooth for a little while. Well, like a week, but still that was pretty impressive considering the shit show it had been leading up to mid-September 1830. Well, let's read that verse 8 and provide some context. Quote, "And now, behold, I say unto you that you shall go unto the Lamanites and preach my gospel unto them. And inasmuch as they receive thy teachings, thou shalt cause my church to be established among them, and thou shalt have revelations, but write them not by way of commandment." End quote. That was verse 8 in the Book of Commandments, chapter 30. This is how Joe ensured his level of control over the Fayette church. He just sent Ollie on a mission to preach to the Native Americans. If the fire starter wasn't there, Joe would have a much easier time at stopping the church from just blowing up in his face. Well, Ollie didn't go it alone. He had a few people that tagged along with him on this mission. This brings us to our 3 newest Naked Mormonism historical reveries: Parley P. Pratt, Orson Pratt, and Ziba Peterson. Of these 3 new members, Ziba Peterson had been a piece in the timeline for quite some time before now, but I skipped introducing him until he distinguished himself. Well, that time is now. So let's start off with talking about Ziba Peterson, and then we'll cover the Pratt Bros. This information is taken from historyofmormonism.com, and there will be a link for it in the show notes. Just a quick side note here before talking about Ziba. There's a link on that historyofmormonism.com website that I decided to indulge myself with. The body of the page has the article, but on the right side of the screen there are a few links. One of them is a 2.5-minute YouTube video interpretation of a conference talk by L. Tom Perry. One is to sign up for the newsletter, but the one I clicked on has a face of a very nice looking woman with the label Ask a Mormon. It brought up a very simple form to fill out, my name, my email address, and my question. I just couldn't help myself. This is what I sent to some unsuspecting, true-believing Mormon on the other side of cyberspace. Quote, I grew up Mormon but became apathetic in my teens. Only recently have I really started studying the church to see if it's true, but I keep running into roadblocks. My question is, if Joseph Smith was a real prophet of God, then why did some of his revelations contradict others or turn out blatantly false? If he was working as God's conduit to earth, wouldn't any mistake in his revelations be a mistake by the omnipotent God of the universe? In that same category, why would the Book of Mormon that Joseph brought about through divine revelation be so contrary to reality in so many ways? How could there possibly be mistakes in the book if it's translated directly through the power of God? I can't seem to wrap my mind around these contradictions, and I'm hoping that whoever receives this email will be able to help me understand Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church better than I do now. End quote. I could have been a lot harsher, but it didn't seem to tickle my fancy while I was writing it, and this seemed poignant enough. However, that does create an opportunity for the listeners of this show. If anybody finds themselves bored or otherwise wanting to understand Mormonism from a TBM's perspective, go to this site and click on the link and punch in a paragraph or 2 of questions that seem to be challenging for a TBM to answer in some way. That's historyofmormonism.com. I just sent mine in, and I plan on reading the reply on air as soon as it comes in. That's historyofmormonism.com. If anybody else wants to do like I did, I'll be happy to read your question and their answer on the air. Simply copy the text of your question and copy the text of their reply and send that in an email to nakedmormonism@gmail.com. That's historyofmormonism.com to fill out the Ask a Mormon page. This offer will stand for as long as I do the show. Any of them that come in, I'll be more than happy to read on the air. Oh, and please don't be afraid to tell them that I sent you there. It seems apropos of what this show truly is about. I would also like to issue a separate call to action for any listeners that are just trolls by nature. Sick 'em, boys. Make them regret the day they put that dialogue box up on that website. Show them that Mormonism can't stand up to the white-hot light of scrutiny. I'll be even happier to read those emails on the air. Once again, in case you missed it, that is historyofmormonism.com, a church-run website, and there is a link to it in the show notes. Click on the Ask a Mormon button on the right side of the screen and fill out the form. All right, now that the fun is over, let's talk about Ziba Peterson and this article that was pulled from historyofmormonism.com. He was born. We don't know exactly where or when, but he was born. We assume he was born in 1810, but don't really know for sure. We assume he was living in Palmyra or Manchester and was one of Joe's neighbors, but we don't know for sure. Unfortunately, the extant history on this guy is a little scarce. He didn't do anything of note before joining the church in its first months of operation, April 1830, and after he left the church, there really isn't much else on him. He didn't leave behind a journal or autobiography or anything of the sort, so we're mostly working from historical inference when it comes to Ziba. We do know that he died as sheriff of Placerville, California in 1849, and during his time as sheriff, the town was given the derogatory nickname Hangtown because of multiple hangings that recently happened under Ziba Peterson's direction. But we aren't concerned with that because that doesn't affect Mormonism. We want to know how he affects our timeline. So, Ziba was baptized into the church on April 18, 1830, and he was listed as one of the 6 attending elders for the first conference on June 9th, meaning he was ordained to the office of an elder sometime in the intervening 2 months there. He hitched his wagon to the Joe train pretty early on and wasn't going to let go for quite some time. There is one story that he's known for in early Mormon history, but before getting to that story, we need to talk about the Pratt brothers and get these guys out on their missions. Parley Parker Pratt. Look at that serendipitous alliteration. We'll refer to him as P cubed. Was one of the early converts to the Mormon Church. Before his conversion to Joe's Church, he was born in Burlington, New York on April 12, 1807. He came to know Hingepin Sidney Rigdon and converted to Rigdon's Campbellite Church in Mentor, Ohio in early 1829. While he was living in Ohio, he made a trip home to Burlington to visit the folks in 1830. Not far from where he disembarked from his ferry ride in Rochester was a little town called Palmyra, where Hiram Smith was residing at the time. I pulled this quote from MormonMissionPrep.com, which is obviously a church-run site, and the website originally pulled the quote from the autobiography of P cubed. I'll leave a link to the entire burning bosom inspiring article in the show notes. Quote, "A man named Hamlin began to tell of a book, a strange book, a very strange book." I'm just reading it how it's written, "in his possession, which had been just published. This book," he said, "purported to have been originally written on plates of either gold or brass by a branch of the tribes of Israel, and to have been discovered and translated by a young man near Palmyra in the state of New York by the aid of visions or the ministry of angels. I inquired of him how or where the book was to be obtained. He promised me the perusal of it at his house the next day, if I would call. I felt a strange interest in the book. Next morning I called at his house, where, for the first time, my eyes beheld the Book of Mormon. That book of books, that record which reveals the antiquities of the New World back to the remotest ages, and which unfolds the destiny of its people and the world for all time to come. That book which contains the fullness of the gospel of a crucified and risen Redeemer. That book which reveals a lost remnant of Joseph, and which was the principal means, in the hands of God, of directing the entire course of my future life. I opened it with eagerness and read its title page. I then read the testimony of several witnesses in relation to the manner of its being found and translated. After this, I commenced its contents by course. I read all day. Eating was a burden. I had no desire for food. Sleep was a burden when the night came, for I preferred reading to sleep. As I read, the Spirit of the Lord was upon me, and I knew and comprehended that the book was true, and plainly and manifestly as a man comprehends and knows that he exists. My joy was now full, as it were, and I rejoiced sufficiently to more than pay me for all the sorrows, sacrifices, and toils of my life. I soon determined to see the young man who had been the instrument of its discovery and translation." End quote. So, that was how P cubed Parley P. Pratt came to join the church, taken from his own autobiography. Soon after he read the Book of Mormon, he made his way to Palmyra and met up with Hiram Smith and asked him all about Joe and his book. Hiram and P cubed reportedly stayed up the whole night talking about Joe and the book. After resting for a day, they made the journey to Fayette so P cubed could get baptized and confirmed. He must have stood out as quite the zealot, because he was ordained to the prestigious and highest office of an elder that same day. he and his wife, Thankful Halsey Pratt, that's right, her name was Thankful, ended up moving out to Utah with the Brighamites, and he was the man responsible for constructing the road through Parley's Canyon in Utah, which is named after him. Thanks to his vigorous polygamous practices, it was estimated in 2011 that he has between 30 to 50,000 living descendants, of which include Mitt Romney and John Huntsman. Those Mormons sure like to have their babies. That was P cubed Parley P. Pratt. So let's talk about his younger brother, Orson Pratt. Orson Pratt was born September 19th, 1811 in Hartford, New York. Both him and P cubed were extremely intelligent, which would later come in handy for both of them. Orson Pratt is credited with the co-invention of an early tachometer that he called the roadometer. During the move out to Utah, he was tasked with watching the wagon wheel and counting how many times it spun around to measure the distance they traveled on any given day. Well, he was sick of spending his days staring at a wheel for hours, so he rigged up a counting mechanism to tell how many rotations were made, and then calculate distance traveled using the circumference of the wagon wheel. Quite ingenious, I might say. Well, this, among other smart guy tricks and published books and teaching positions and all kinds of other stuff, earns him the nickname of Orson Brain Power Pratt, or just OBP Pratt for short. OBP was looking for the right religion at the age of 18 when his older brother, P cubed, found the Book of Mormon and converted to Mormonism. P cubed went to his younger brother, OBP, and told him about Joe and his magic book, and Orson OBP Pratt was convinced, and very soon after this, he joined the church, and of course was baptized on his 19th birthday, September 19th, 1830. Alright, now that we've introduced our three newest relevant people in the timeline, let's advance that timeline a little bit. Joe had issued his revelation commanding Ollie to go preach to the Lamanites, which he actually ended up doing, just not alone. I would read this next revelation from the Book of Commandments like usual, but for some reason it's not there. It's included in the 1835 publication of the Doctrine and Covenants, but it's completely absent from the 1833 Book of Commandments. I don't know why that is. It seems kind of weird. But I'll just read this from the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, section 54, which is today's section 32. Quote, "And now concerning my servant Parley P. Pratt, behold, I say unto him, that as I live, I will that he shall declare my gospel, and learn of me, and be meek and lowly of heart. And that which I have appointed unto him is that he shall go with my servants Oliver Cowdery and Peter Whitmer Jr. into the wilderness amongst the Lamanites, and Ziba Peterson also shall go with them, and I myself will go with them and be in their midst. And I am their advocate with the Father, and nothing shall prevail. And they shall give heed to that which is written, and pretend to no other revelation. And they shall pray always, that I may unfold them to their understanding. And they shall give heed unto these words, and trifle not. And I will bless them. Amen." End quote. All right, I would have skipped the last part of that because it wasn't really relevant. But the whole thing was just one verse and 2 sentences. Well, 3 sentences if you count the amen as a single sentence like it does. Anyway, this was the revelation given to P cubed and Ziba Peterson, calling them on their mission to the Lamanites. As we'll come to find out, this was the most important mission in all of the church's history. Some seriously heavy hitters in the Mormonite movement are converted as a result of this one single mission. This is a paragraph pulled from an article on eom.byu.edu, which is BYU's online Mormon history library. This article is titled Lamanite Mission of 1830 to 1831, and there will be a link for it in the show notes. Quote, "In 4 weeks in northeastern Ohio, the elders baptized approximately 130 converts, 50 of them from Kirtland. These new members made Kirtland their headquarters. Among the converts were men who would become leaders in the church. Sidney Rigdon, Frederick G. Williams, Lyman White, Newell K. Whitney, Levi Hancock, and John Murdoch. Two other prominent men, Edward Partridge and Orson Hyde, joined the church soon after the missionaries departed. By the end of 1830, membership in Ohio had reached 300, nearly triple the number of members in New York. In December, after learning of the great Ohio harvest, Joseph Smith received a revelation directing the New York Saints to gather to the Kirtland area. Doctrine and Covenants, section 37, which most did in 1831. End quote. All right, like I said, that was an important mission, and that was a lot of names, but almost everybody in that list is going to be getting their own names, so we can, try and keep them straight. We just have to wait until they actually come into the timeline. The more I look at all of this research, the more I begin to understand just how much work is ahead of us on this show. The minuscule amount of time that the church spent trying to grow in New York against all of this opposition is just about to come to a close. The struggling church was barely able to tread water in the face of all the persecution against it while in New York. Joe was barely able to hold it down and could barely handle putting out every fire that cropped up. Just in time, the church received a huge boost in membership. Maybe boost is the wrong word. It was more like Joe had created the red Zord piece of the mega church Zord. He had the brains and control center, and he was running the majority of the operations, but he needed a lot more pieces and a lot more people to become formidable enough to actually have any staying power as the complete, well-oiled, Satan-crushing, multicolored juggernaut that the church would soon become. This mission out to Jackson County, Missouri, would be the first tendrils of the power web that Joe was spinning for all to be either caught up and consumed by, or fear, resulting in them trying to tear it all down. The best part about sending off these four guys is the calculated measure on Joe's part. He sent out 3 people that had been with the church since its beginning, with one brand-ass spanking new zealot to keep the fire burning in their bosom. The most important part of the strategy was Joe sending Ollie away for a few months. If Ollie wasn't there and was occupied on the road preaching the gospel, the worst thing he could do was not be able to convert somebody. However, if Ollie continued to stay in New York, he might keep on trying to undermine Joe like he had successfully done so many times in the past. Without Ollie's naysaying and backbiting getting in the way, Joe could get a lot done with the new converts in the church. All except for the people living in Colesville, of course. Joe wasn't going back there. In fact, Joe saved that for Orson Brainpower Pratt in April of 1831 because he didn't want to go himself for fear of public lynching. He sent a brand new face, and nobody in Colesville was any wiser to Joe's continued influence in the area. But, like I said earlier, our early formative time in New York is about to come to a close. It's in early 1831 that Joe officially moved the congregation of the church out to Kirtland, Ohio, and the ball really got rolling. But that will be the subject of our next historical episode. We'll be focusing on Hingepin Sidney Rigdon for a fair amount of the show, and we'll really come to understand the nature of his name-o-nickname. To close out this episode, we need to give a name-o-nickname to Ziba Peterson. I know his name is already pretty awesome and unique, and he probably doesn't need or deserve to get his own name on this show, especially considering the amount of time he spent in the church. Regardless, there is a story that came out of the missionary trip that gives us something to latch on. Ziba Peterson will be known in our historical analysis as Dick Ziban Peterson. This is for a couple reasons. In quite a few historical texts, he's referred to as Richard Ziba Peterson, but usually went by Ziba, thus adding the Dick before Ziban. Then you might wonder why add an N to his already awesome name. Well, that's because it's a brand name for an antidepressant, and you guys know just how much Mormons like their antidepressants. All right, Mormons having the highest nationwide rates of antidepressant consumption isn't why I named him that, nor is it really a joking matter. It's pretty fucked up, actually. No, the reason why we're calling him Ziba is because I see him as a bit of an antidepressant type of guy. I think it was probably pretty upbeat and, he knew his Jesus and he was happy and was good at spreading his happy spirit to others. Well, let's read one of the only stories we have about him explicitly taking actions to lighten up the mood and see how it worked. This is taken from MormonHistoricSites.com, and I'll leave a link for it in the show notes. It's entitled Ziba Peterson from Missionary to Hanging Sheriff by H. Dean Garrett. This is on page 29. Quote, Ziba Peterson and his companions left Fayette, New York, about the 17th of October to begin the 1,000-mile journey. The prophet Joseph recorded, quoting Joseph now, they bade adieu to their brethren and friends and commenced their journey, preaching by the way and leaving a sealing testimony behind them, lifting up their voice like a trump in the different villages through which they passed. End quote, back to quoting the article. They preached to the Indians near Buffalo and then traveled to Kirtland, Ohio, where they achieved great success among the followers of Sidney Rigdon and their neighbors. Parley P. Pratt was an earlier acquaintance of Sidney Rigdon. Sidney had previously visited the wooded area near Lake Erie, where Pratt had settled with his new wife. Rigdon had introduced Pratt and others to the Reformed Baptist doctrine, and now Pratt returned to introduce Sidney to the restored gospel. In addition, Pratt and the other missionaries taught several of Rigdon's congregations. As a result of their work, they baptized 127 souls, and this number soon increased to 1,000. A further example of Ziba's involvement in the success of the missionary work in Ohio occurred on the evening of the 13th of November. The missionaries arrived in Warrenville, Ohio, and Ziba conducted a meeting at the home of the newly converted John Murdoch. Several baptisms resulted from this meeting, including the baptism of John Murdoch's wife. About 50 miles west of Kirtland, the missionaries ran into some problems. Here we go. This is where Ziba's nickname starts to come in. At the home of Simeon Carter, another new convert, Parley P. Pratt was arrested on a warrant and taken before a judge who insisted on Pratt's paying a fine or going to jail. During a long night of hassle before the judge, Parley invited Ziba to sing a hymn. Oh, happy are they. Unfortunately, the hymn did not seem to brighten the night. Oh, bummer for Ziba. His random a cappella singing in the courtroom wasn't appreciated for some reason. The next day, Pratt escaped from the sheriff and caught up with his companions as they made their way out of Ohio. When the missionaries left Ohio, they took with them another companion, Frederick G. Williams, who was one of their recent converts. They traveled through a very wintry countryside to Cincinnati, down the Ohio River to Illinois, and across to St. Louis, where they waited out a severe storm for several days. They were finally able to cross the Mississippi River and walk hundreds of miles across the wilds of Missouri to the small border town of Independence. Independence. Their final destination was located on the line separating the state of Missouri from the Indian lands. End quote. That's where Ziba gets his nickname. He tried to anti-depress the mood of the courts, but the judge, who was already in a bad mood and tired to begin with, just became more frustrated with Ziba's little in-court outburst of a cappella hymnal. It probably didn't help that it was apparently like 11 at night when the court convened to convict P. Cube until he paid his fine for unknown charges. So, good try with trying to make everybody happier, Ziba, but it was to no avail. So that's it for the historical analysis of this episode. Let me take a second to digress about depression in the church in Utah. Like I said earlier, it's no joking matter, and it really has nothing to do with Ziba's nickname here. The last couple of times that I've traveled to Utah, I've spent time with Preston Yahmes, the ultimate overruler of the Nemo Outer Darkness Kingdom. He's located in a pretty affluent part of the SLC Valley and is completely surrounded by true-believing Mormons. He's told me on a few occasions that if you go to any of the people in the neighborhood, you won't find a single drop of alcohol in their house. But you will find a fucking sailor's tackle box full of antidepressants and mood elevators and muscle relaxants and all other myriad prescription drugs to deal with every conceivable mental or physical illness that plagues people living a horribly repressed and depressed life. The one recurring thing I hear from anybody when I tell them that I'm from Utah is they say that Mormons are the nicest, happiest people they've ever met. I can agree with them for the most part. So many Mormons are awe-inspiringly positive and overly nice to each other and even to outsiders. So nice that it might be a little creepy sometimes. Do you really think that's natural? Is that really who they are in their deepest heart of hearts? Do they just have a happy stick shoved so far up their ass that they can't help but smile the pain away? No, it's all fucking fake. It's all a facade. They deny their very nature as a person to express any emotion other than happiness, no matter what they're feeling on the inside, and it's the culture that forces them to do that. They think that if they aren't happy, then they aren't being righteous enough. This forced repression of true emotions leads to all sorts of mental problems that manifest in dozens of ways. Obsessive behavior, so-called addictions to non-addictive substances, depression, anxiety, manic depressive behaviors, reckless impulsive buying, and a bunch of other serious problems that come along with repressing who you really are. They're all problems that plague the average Utah-dwelling, true-believing Mormon. If a Mormon father and husband spends hours a day watching porn, it's not because he's addicted. He's engaging in an obsessive behavior that he has sole control over because he can't stand his real life that he seems to have no control over anymore. It's the same thing as someone that's cutting or Amazon binging or engaging in any other self-destructive obsession. They feel like they can't control their life in any way, and they're buried in their own lack of freedom. So they find something they can control, whether it's the number of ejaculations in a 2-hour span with your wife and kids in the other room, or the click of a mouse on the buy now button, or just how much the cut bleeds. Treating these problems with chemicals and antidepressants is a crackhead's way of fixing the problem. They don't try to fix the problem at its root. They just want to suck a dick right now to get some goddamn crack. It's treating the symptom, not the problems, and it's fucked up. If the problem itself isn't treated, the negative effects will inevitably manifest in some destructive way. It doesn't do any good to just treat the symptom of the problem. And that's where Mormonism fails so monumentally. They tell you that the less you sin and the more righteous you are, the more happy you will become, which is wrong on so many levels, especially when they are the ones setting the threshold of that sin and controlling the punishment and shame in reaction to it. I've made it no secret that I feel the negative cognitive effects of the church all the time, and I've been out for a third of my short life now. Being on the outside, I see the mental and social problems that the church creates any time I visit Utah. I see people that act holier than thou constantly while trying to conceal the mote in their own eye. Most Utards have a story of a friend or family member that committed suicide or attempted to do so while being treated for severe depression. Most teens in Utah go through a depressive phase. Some recover, most don't, and worse yet, some don't even survive the depression. I remember all of the lectures and school assemblies about depression and not killing yourself because the CDC sees the abnormally high rate of teen and male suicides that plague Utah. The rate of male suicide in 2013 was more than twice the overall average American rate. Nationally, Utah ranks third in overall suicides, being beaten out only by Montana and Alaska, and one of those is dark for half of the year. Utah has one of the highest levels of antidepressant and anti-anxiety pill consumption. There is a root to this cause of all these negative effects. When people aren't happy, they become clinically depressed. There's a lot of physiology and chemical level impeding neuron pathways in the brain that factor into it, but by and large, the more things people are happy about in their life, the more happy they are. It's very simple. I mean, just put yourselves in the shoes of a believing Mormon. Every day, you are constantly fighting the urge to sin in some way. It's something you consider a character flaw, like obsessively watching porn or something, and it's always on your mind, even though you know it's bad and God doesn't like it when you do it. You know that you can go in and talk to your bishop about it, but then you have to deal with all the social ramifications of atoning for your sin, which always carries a heavy burden of public shaming. So you don't go talk to the bishop about this quote-unquote porn addiction, and instead continue to sin, even though it's making God angry. You go to church every Sunday, and you put on the fake happy game face so nobody will know that you're sinning behind closed doors. And you act all happy, and you tell all your neighbors and friends that go to your church about the recent Ensign article that you read this morning, which you only read to keep from watching porn on the Sabbath. And then the rest of the Sunday is consumed by other calling activities or spending time with the family or scripture study. Then it goes to Monday morning. Go to work in town and interact daily with people that you see and talk to every Sunday. So that happy game face you put on for church needs to be equipped for every day of work as well, just so people don't think that you're sinning. Monday night rolls around and it's family home evening. The church lesson a day after church. You have to prepare a lesson for your kids or find some wholesome movie to watch that doesn't have any sexual innuendo because, of course, if your kids watch a movie with anything sexual in it, they'll start watching porn that very next day. So then Tuesday rolls around, back to work with the same game face again, never talking to your friends or coworkers about what is really going on in your life and keeping the conversations extremely topical and superficial. Tuesday night, you have a meeting for Elders Quorum leadership. Wednesday night is mutual night. The kids go to church and do an activity with all their friends from school and church, and you and the wife get a night home together. Unfortunately, you haven't had a minute alone to indulge in this so-called porn addiction, so half the night you spend in the office instead of spending time with your wife. You know that she knows what you're doing, but neither of you wants to talk about it. You just know that it hurts her, because she feels like she isn't good enough for you, so you have to go somewhere else to satisfy those depraved sexual urges. This only serves to stress you out more and strain harder on your already thin marriage. Sure, you could go talk to the bishop instead, but he would bring your wife in to inform her on your addiction, and you can't stand how much that conversation would hurt her. Instead, you just stay in the office and avoid her as much as you possibly can, depressing the both of you even more. Thursday rolls around and it's Scouts Day. You have to throw together some fun activity for all the scouts in the neighborhood to do. All of them come to your house and you have to provide an hour or two of activities for them to do so they aren't bored. Friday comes along and it was a hard week at work. The physical part wasn't any tougher than usual, but you're emotionally beat. You've been wearing that same happy game face all week, and it's finally taken its toll on you, just like it does every week of every month of your entire life. Friday night rolls around, and the kids are out spending time with their friends. Your wife is taking care of her calling tonight, making phone calls, planning out next week's lesson, and you have some free time. Better make the most of this rare commodity and head to the office for a little mini-me time. Your wife knows where you are, and those feelings of inadequacy come flooding back into her mind, distracting her during the various phone calls she's making. Saturday comes along, and it's a very special day.
Saturday is a special day. It's that day we get ready for Sunday. We clean the house and we shop at the store, so we won't have to work until Monday.
I'm going to bet that clip just sent a chill up every ex-Mormon's spine. So that's what Saturday is all about. You have to take care of all the stuff around the house because there's no working on Sunday, and that keeps you busy for the majority of the day. The kids spend the morning with you helping do the chores, but it's always a fight to get them to do anything, so eventually you give in and tell them they're done and can go be with their friends. Saturday evening comes along and you have some alone time with your wife. You watch a movie together, sitting on opposite sides of the couch, with the intrusive communication barrier sitting firmly in between you. The movie is over, and it's about time for bed, but you have to send off an email before you go to bed. At least that's what you tell your wife, even though she's not convinced. You go to the office and finish your duty to yourself, and then you go to slip into bed where your wife is peacefully sleeping. You look at the clock and you see that you've been watching porn for over an hour, and your wife went to sleep a while ago. You lay your head down with the dread for the next day's activities bouncing around inside your head. You want to be faithful to the church and do well in your calling, but you're simply disgusted by the thought of going through another Sunday, doing the same song and dance with everybody around you. The worst part is, once Sunday is over, you wake up on Monday morning and do it all over again, without a single break in the monotony. Every day is the same, and nothing ever gets better. The dread and loathing for your life weighs on your mind more and more with each passing year of the same exact schedule. Now tell me, in this situation, what the fuck do you have to be happy about in life? You're not in control of a single joyless minute of your life. Even when you can get away from the family for a little while to watch porn or for some kind of dopamine kick in your life, you're still not free. You're weighed down by your sins and the shame of your actions, and you can't do anything to escape the mindset. Sure, the antidepressants might help, but they're treating a symptom of a much larger problem. There's simply no joy in your life. And you can't be happy in a joyless vacuum of a life, but you've made commitments to the church, and you were raised telling yourself that these feelings are the consequences of sin, and there's no chipping away from that frame of mind. Your whole world is warped beyond what anybody would consider healthy, and you're stuck. Why not just fucking kill yourself? Do you understand why the church is so damaging? It creates a problem in your life, then fills up your schedule and doesn't give you any of your own alone time to fix it because you're so busy with church-related activities. And then, of course, the church offers you the solution to the problem that it gave you. That solution, of course, is more church. I often hear the argument posited, even if the church isn't true, it's a good way to raise a child. Now, growing up Mormon, I can agree with that argument to a certain extent. Mormonism has some really low rates of teenage alcohol consumption. If a kid goes to church, there is a possible friend base of a lot of people in that child's community, and it helps a lot with early social development. The mutual service activities are awesome and teach kids how to help out the elderly in the neighborhood. There are plenty of benefits to the church when it comes to raising a kid, but that's true of any type of community or social gathering with a structure like this. It's all the other shit that comes along with it that makes the church an overall negative to society. Any structure that systematically produces high rates of suicide, warped ideals of sexuality, and builds in a shame-based reformation feature that only serves to damage anybody involved is not a good structure and is definitionally a parasitic drain on society. There are better ways to get the benefits of the Mormon religion without tacking on all the fucked up parts that only serve to mind fuck the participants and make them fear their own dicks. Society as a whole has outgrown the church, and it's time for the church to realize that if it doesn't change in drastic ways, it will be cut off from our progressive humanistic society. Although, I have to say, would the church shriveling up from lack of membership really be all that bad? had some listener mail to get to. First off, got a message in from Joel. He says, "Hey, so I have a question that has been on my mind lately. Was Joe just a straight-up hustler, liar, even in his days of treasure hunting, or did he really believe he had a gift of seeing? Meaning, was this his form of scamming people, or did he really think he was going to find treasure using his supposed gifts? And how many people were in on the scams if that's what they were? Was his whole family and possibly most of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon just in on the scam, or were they real believers? I'm not sure why any of this matters to me, but I guess I really wish some of what was done with real belief and faith, and not just scam after scam with multiple accomplices." Well, that's a good question, Joel, and I'm just going to have to default and say I don't know. Honestly, I kind of picture it being like how, I guess fundamentalist Wiccas practice their spells and stuff right now. It's just a level of confirmation bias and ignoring the negatives, right? So if somebody performs a spell that they ask they're going to have good luck the next day, and then they're walking down the street and they find a $20 bill sitting on the ground, it's a confirmation bias. So when Joe was doing these treasure hunts, there was probably some times that they would find something buried, something from the Native Americans that were there, or something from somebody that used to live there a little while before them, or whatever. They probably occasionally found just random shit in the ground when they were digging. And when one of these things, Joe would look into his hat and say, "Oh, I see something over here." And then they would dig for a few days or a few hours, and they would find something, whether it was valuable or not. And Joe would say, "That's the treasure that I was seeing." That was a confirmation bias. So at a certain level, I think that can fool a person into believing their own bullshit. And I think Joe was a victim of his own bullshit, basically, in a lot of cases. Now, when it came to, like, with boss man Josiah Stowell and Joseph hiding the feather underground and digging and finding it, that was kind of manipulative, and that seemed like it was more of a blatant scam. It was kind of the same thing with Joe going to Joseph Knight Sr. and saying, "Hey, I know where there's this chunk of silver or a chunk of gold or whatever that's buried. It's as big as my leg, and we can just throw it in a boat and ship it down the river and into Pittsburgh." And it's like, a lot of these things seemed fairly manipulative, but there was also enough, I would assume there was also enough confirmation bias there that he thought he did have some kind of gift. Was the Book of Mormon a complete con? I think so. I posited earlier in the episode that I think it's possible that Joe and Ollie were in on it together completely, and that they had an idea that eventually they would just take over, or they would both, co-run the church, basically. I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you consider how much of a part Ollie was playing in the early church, and that, things that Joe wasn't doing himself, and Joe was just kind of the idea man, coming up with these revelations. So, it kind of makes sense with, those two conspiring with each other, but you also might need David Whitmer and John Whitmer and Sidney Rigdon and a few other people in on that as well to make that work, which is possible. It's just the problem with a conspiracy like that is the more people you add, the less likely it becomes. So when we're talking about a conspiracy theory that is, 180 years removed from what we're looking at, it's kind of hard to posit who was conning who believed what. So, I mean, was it a scam or were they real believers? I think Joe was the same victim of his own confirmation bias when it came to the church as it was with his, his scrying, his seer stoning, because eventually he got to a point where he believed what he was saying, obviously, and that's why he stuck with it for so long. Or maybe he did realize it was all bullshit, and and he died knowing that it was bullshit. I doubt that. I think he did believe his own shit when it came to the Book of Mormon and the church. But like I said, Joel, I kind of got to check out on that question. I just got to say I don't know. I know a lot of the facts that surround it, but I can't pretend that I know exactly what people were thinking. I can only posit hypotheticals, and that seems possible. So that's my opinion on it. But thanks for sending that in, Joel. Got in a pretty interesting email from G. Christopher. I'm just going to kind of read most of it because it was all really fascinating. He says, don't know if you came across the most damning evidence or lack thereof in the case of the Book of Mormon coming straight out of the BYU archaeological studies themselves. I heard about this years ago, but was never able to find it. Then I ran across this article from Wikipedia. It's fascinating. Check it out. Apparently the article is called LDS Funded Archaeology. In 1955, a man named Thomas Ferguson, who was a Latter-day Saint and the founder of the New World Archaeological Foundation, with 5 years of funding from the church, began to dig through Mesoamerica for evidence of the veracity of the Book of Mormon claims. So in a 1961 newsletter, this was after the 5-year research fund dried up, Ferguson predicted that although nothing had been found, that the Book of Mormon cities would be found within 10 years. In 1972, that was 11 years later, Christian scholar Hal Huey wrote to Ferguson questioning the progress given the stated timetable in which the cities would be found. Replying to Huey as well as secular and non-secular requests, Ferguson wrote in a letter dated June 5th, 1972, 10 years have passed. I had sincerely hoped that Book of Mormon cities would be positively identified within 10 years, and time has proved me wrong in my anticipation. So this guy, Thomas Ferguson, got a 5-year research grant to find archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. I bet that the fund was probably pretty wide. He could probably stretch that pretty far. After the 5 years were up, he released in a newsletter and said, we didn't find anything in 5 years, but if we keep at it, I expect that in 10 years we'll find something. So then he continued on for 10 more years and was dead silent. So this guy, Hal Huey, wrote a letter to him and was like, hey, what the fuck's up, bro? You find anything there that confirmed your book? And the guy wrote back, then Thomas Ferguson wrote back, 10 years have passed, and I had sincerely hoped that the Book of Mormon cities would be positively identified, and time has proved me wrong in my anticipation. Oh, that's so beautiful. He's a Mormon archaeologist, a Mormon scholar working for BYU, running off of an LDS research fund, and he can't find anything that bolsters the claim. And then there's a second part of the email, which is even better. Apparently, his colleague D. Green was editor of the Archaeological Society newsletter that BYU published and had an article published in the summer of '69. It was called A Journal of Mormon Thought. He acknowledged that the New World Archaeological Foundation findings did not back up the veracity of Book of Mormon claims. After this article and another 6 years of fruitless search, Ferguson published a 29-page paper in '75 entitled Written Symposium on Book of Mormon Geography. Response of Thomas S. Ferguson to the Norman and Sorensen papers, in which he concluded, I'm afraid that up to this point I must agree with D. Green, who has told us that to date, there is no Book of Mormon geography. The real implication of this paper is that you can't set the Book of Mormon geography down anywhere because it is fictional and will never meet the requirement of dirt archaeology. I should say, what is in the ground will never conform to what is in the book. Boo fucking yah. That is epic. So these two guys that were running off of this concluded definitely, one of them was saying, I wished that there would be evidence that would turn up in 15 years of research and never found it. And then this guy said 20 years after the initial fund was written, everything, it's all fake. It's all just a fabrication, and what's in the ground will never match what's in the book. That's so awesome. G. Christopher, thank you. I love getting in those emails where people do research on a single topic like that and just break it all down. Beautifully done. Thank you. And I would love to read any more of those that anybody send in on the show. I got an email from Theon. He said, you've casually mentioned a few instances of Joe Smith ordering Porter Rockwell to assassinate people that were inconvenient. How many hits did Joe order? Might make a good show topic to lay out their stories. Yes, it will make a good topic when they come up in the storyline. Because honestly, I don't know. I'm going to have to happen upon them. I know for a fact that Joe didn't order any direct hits saying, here is this person, Orrin Porter Rockwell go kill them, because he was smarter than that. He wouldn't leave a paper trail. But we do have him saying something bad is going to happen to Lilburn Boggs, and then 3 days later he gets shot by a shotgun, which was old pistol packing Port's one of his weapons of choice, either those or pistols. And then I believe that there are some others in there. I'm not sure the exact timing, wording, or the context of them, though. Those are just things that I'm going to have to happen upon. If anybody does know how many hits that Porter actually performed, feel free to send in an email. I'd like to know. I'd like to be able to pass the information on. But as I am aware, I believe he was more just when shit would go down, he would just kind of stand by Joe's side and take care of him, whether that involved, beating people away or shooting them or whatever. He was just kind of Joe's safety bodyguard type of guy. But thanks for sending in the email, Theon. All right, I think that's it for listener email. If you guys want to have your emails read on the air or have any questions or anything that you want to get in contact with the show about, go to nakedmormonismpodcast.com and go to the contact page and type in all your information there in the message, or you can just send an email directly to nakedmormonism@gmail.com. Did have a couple of guest appearances to mention real quick. Before recording this episode, I had a fun, interesting conversation with Thad and Brad Grace of the Evil Twin podcast. They're doing a whole block of episodes on Mormonism, and we just talked everything Mormon. One of them is an ex-Mormon. The other one is Nevermo. It was interesting to talk to both of them and their experiences in the church, and just talk lots of Mormonism. That's what I'm good at and what I like to do. So their episode should be airing on October 3rd. I'm not sure. I think it'll be episode 24, something to that effect. Hopefully it'll be on there. That's what they said, October 3rd. But yeah, be looking out for that Evil Twin podcast. I was on the most recent episode of Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park, hosted by Deb and Beth, and it was a fucking party. It was so much fun. I've been on there 2 other times, and it's always fun to hang out with them and just talk everything Mormonism. Well, this is called Mormon Mania. It was Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park, episode 41, Even More Mormon Mania. And I gotta admit, we had an absolute party. It was a lot of fun hanging out and talking everything Mormonism. And, just as always, thank you for having me on, Deb and Beth, and just having a good old Mormon Gab Fest. It was a party. So if you want to check out that show, check out the show notes for a link to that show, and you'll be able to find it there just in this episode's show notes, or you can look on the Naked Mormonism Facebook page, and it will be posted up there as well. I did want to mention that last week I went and hung out at the Southeast Wyoming ex-Mormon meetup group, basically, on Facebook, and it was just a lot of fun to do a meet and greet like that, and actually see some people that are listening to the show and talk with them and get their perspectives on things. And I passed out a few business cards, and hopefully those people will listen to the show, and it's just a group that I'm excited and happy to be a part of, and I look forward to spending more time with them in the future. So all of the members of that group, thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me up there. I really had a good time. Had a couple of new NAMO juvenile delinquents to thank. We have Matt, Nick, and Chris. Thank you all very much for joining in on supporting the show. Your long journey up through the ranks of the NAMO Out of Darkness is beginning, and I wish you the very best of luck in this long and arduous but very noble and worthy path. Next, had a few adolescent rebels to thank. We have Elizabeth and Aaron. Thank you both very much for supporting the show. Your support goes a long way to making sure that the show does come out on time every week, and keeping me motivated to keep cranking away on the research and doing all the work that is behind the show. So thank you for your support, all of you, very, very much. Also, I had somebody contact the Facebook page by the name of Patrick Matthew Klein. If anybody follows the Facebook page, they might recognize him, that he was the guy that I had a little bit of a street debate with when I was on vacation in Maui recently. And it was a lot of fun talking with the guy. He just spends all day riding around on his bicycle with a 10-foot rain gutter cross and preaching Jesus. So he was nice enough to hop onto a Google Hangout with me, and we talked for a long time and just had a good conversation just about everything Jesus, everything God. And hopefully I didn't scare him off or anything, because I want to talk to him later on. Partly because it was so much fun talking to him, and I like talking to theists and finding out what they believe and why. And also because I looked at the recording and it's not great. The quality of it is pretty unpleasant, and that's for the first half of it. And then the second half of the conversation, we got disconnected and had to reconnect, and there was a glitch, and I lost his entire side of the recording. So I'm going to release just the episode, the 30-something minutes of it that I did get, because the conversation was interesting, but we really dove in pretty hard after that, and I'm pretty sad that it didn't record, because it was a fun conversation, and I think it's something that people could benefit from hearing, and Patrick is a really fun guy. So I did promise that I'll give him a plug to his Facebook page. He's maxed out on friends, but he can take followers. That's Patrick Matthew Klein, spelled C-L-I-N-E, and he also has available for download PDFs of his 11 books that he's written, just an autobiography of interesting Jesus shit, apparently. I haven't read them, I haven't looked at them, but he has the links for them up on his Facebook page. So be looking out for that episode. It's not going to be a full anything. I'm probably just going to release it next week or something, but keep an eye out. Let me know what you think. The conversation, like I said, is really truncated. We dove in much deeper, and I let him get away with a lot less shit once we got into the deeper conversation. But, oh well, I hope you guys enjoy it. One thing I had to add in real quick, I normally don't do this, but this was too good to ignore. We got in an iTunes review from Brandon, and it was amazing. I'm going to read it real quick. I don't do this ever, but it's just too good that I couldn't help but share it. The subtitle of it is "Fucking Your History Hard," and of course, "fucking" is spelled with a bunch of Grolixes in it. He says, "Embrace your naked Mormon history. Throw it on the bed. Roll around and search it. Make your testimony hurt so good. And do this knowing it is not immoral to know your history." That is epic. Thank you for sending that in, Brandon. Reading these iTunes reviews really gets me pumped up, because they help so much with people finding the show and spreading the good word. So when I see a review like that is just so hilarious and 5-star, that it just makes me so happy. So thank you for sending that in, Brandon. It really it really excited me, and even if it was in a little bit of a perverted way, yes, it made me even more excited. Thanks, Brandon. I had one person that I wanted to thank and distinguish for something that was awfully kind of them to do. Got a message in from Brandon, and he said he acquired this book called The Council of the 50, A Documentary History, and he just wanted me to have it because apparently I might make better use of it. He sent the book, and it's really, really fascinating. First, I'm just going to read the little footnote that they wrote in there, which is really fantastic. Bryce, we love the podcast and how you bring life to our history. Thank you for your work in making the world a better place. Brandon and Heather. That was something really special and something I'll cherish in this book, so thank you both. To get some sort of idea of what it's about, I'm just going to read the first paragraph of the foreword. The foreword is entitled, "The Past is a Foreign Country." Prior to editing this remarkable collection of documents, I knew the Council of 50, sometimes known as the Kingdom of God or the Grand Council, as an intriguing footnote in Mormon history. After poring over the holographs and typescripts of minutes and diaries, I was engulfed in a world of secret councils, political deliberations, and absorbing episodes. I did not come away unmoved. These records gave me an intimate introduction to a most remarkable group of men and a pivotal moment in the early history of the Mormon Restoration movement. The Council of 50 by Jebediah S. Rogers. I cannot wait to sink my brain into this amazing book. And Brandon and Heather, I cannot thank you enough for sending it. And I hope that incorporating the information that's held in this book will be enough of a tribute to your very, very kind gift. So thank you for sending it to me. I can't express how much I appreciate it. I believe that is everything for this episode. We'll get together next time and probably talk about primarily the mission out to Jackson County, Missouri, and everything that happened there, and their return in 1831 and what all was happening at that time. So, like I said, be watching out for the next episode, and hope to talk at you again here on the Naked Mormonism podcast.
Oh, how happy